Okay, well, here we are. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Santa Barbara Audubon Society's monthly program. I'm Catherine Emery, Executive Director for Santa Barbara Audubon, and I'll be hosting tonight. We're happy to have with us this evening, Andrea Jones from Audubon California, who will be presenting Estuaries, California's marine nurseries. I will introduce Andrea after some brief announcements. A few tech notes as we begin. If you have come into the meeting automatically muted, and we ask you to please stay muted throughout the presentation. If during the presentation you have a question, please use the chat function to use it. I'll be monitoring it, and we'll convey your questions to Andrea during a Q&A session at the end. Our webmaster, David Levasheff, is providing tech support for this evening. Thank you so much, David. Now let's go to our president, Dolores Pollock, for some brief chapter announcements.
Thank you, Catherine. Good evening, everybody. Great to see everyone. During the shutdown, which is, as you know, now almost a year old, we have welcomed many new board members, and I just wanted to mention their names tonight, and I do hope you get to meet them in person soon. First, we have Dottie Pock. She is our new education chair. Then there's Ron Hurst at large and Rob Lindsay at large. Both Rob and Ron were presidents of the chapter in the distant past, in the 90s. Then we have Scott Pipkin, who is at the Botanic Garden. He is also at large. Mo McFadden is our new communications chair. She's a longtime Eyes in the Sky volunteer, and before that, a Snowy Plover docent. Excuse me. And our newest person is Brianna Saptivy, who is from the Natural History Museum. She will be our co-vice president. We still have one opening. That is 15 board members that we have. They're wonderful, but we still have one opening, and that is for a development chair. So please let me know if you have anybody in mind who would be good in that position. It's basically fundraising and event coordination. So as I say, I wanted to mention names of these people, thank them for stepping forward to work with the chapter and to give them a warm welcome. I'm so happy to have them. It's a lot of talent. Next, I wanted to mention that our newest edition of our newsletter, El Tecolote, is as of today on the website. We thank David Levasheff for putting it up there immediately. And thank all the people who worked on it. It's another big newsletter filled with interesting, entertaining, fabulous information. And you know, Joyce Carrasa is the editor, and then Alex Luce is the layout person. Many other people have helped. You'll see articles by a number of people. So we want to thank them all. It's a wonderful product. And my last announcement has to do with an upcoming event. As you know, during the pandemic, we've had to rethink all of our events and everything else. For example, having this program on Zoom. The latest event to be rethought is the winter bird count for kids. This is usually held in the winter, in January. This year, it's going to be held in April, late April, for obvious reasons. The co-chairs are Judy Blue and Joan Cottage. Plans are underway right now for a no-touch event, quite different from what we've had in past years, but still introducing children from 8 to 16 to the fun of bird watching. People should register by April the 10th. To register, you go to our website, santabarbaraAudubon.org. Once registered, a goodie bag will be prepared for each person who registers. We're going to be ready for 100 kids. The goodie bag will have a free t-shirt, which says Winter Bird Count for Kids on it, and a souvenir bird list for each person who registers. These will be picked up ahead of time between April 24th and April 29th. Many more instructions are on the website, and you will see them also in our newsletter. But basically, the date to remember is register by April the 10th. pick up your material towards the end of the month between April 24th and 29th. All COVID precautions will prevail. And we're wondering, is this going to be more fun than the usual format? Usually it's a great event with almost 100 kids. Let's see what happens this year. And I want to thank the City of Goleta, who again is underwriting the cost of the event, and all the people working on it, taking quite a few people to rethink and rearrange our very popular winter bird count for kids. And now back to Catherine. Catherine?
Thank you, Dolores. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Andrea Jones. Andrea Jones is Director of Bird Conservation for Audubon California. For the past 13 years, she has worked from coast to coast on Audubon. She has worked with staff and the network of Audubon chapters across the state to implement conservation projects at high priority important bird areas. In particular, she has focused on leading Audubon's conservation efforts along the coast and in estuaries, focusing on restoration, advocacy, and engagement. Her work has also included providing science expertise and negotiating conservation agreements at saline lakes, including Owens Lake and the Salton Sea. She oversees efforts in priority bird species and serves as the spokeswoman for bird conservation across California. Prior to California, Andrea worked at Massachusetts Audubon, where she served as the director of the coastal waterbird and grassland bird programs. Andrea, thank you for being here. And I'd just like to add a couple notes. Again, feel free to put your questions in the chat function and I will keep note of them. And that's pretty much it. Thank you and welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, well, thank you everyone for having me today. I'm just waving from just up the road. I live in Ventura County, just outside of Ojai, so not too far away, and just recently moved back to this region. So I'm really happy to be on the central coast of California, which is one of my favorite places. So I'm going to talk to you about Audubon's work in the Pacific Flyway along our coastline. I'll touch on some projects from Alaska south, but we'll really focus on our work in California. And mostly what I'm going to be talking today about is estuaries, because Audubon is really doubling down on our investment in California's estuaries, recognizing the importance of the estuaries in for their role in birds and habitat and commerce, and also because of the threats estuaries face, particularly going forward with climate change, such as sea level rise and ocean acidification. So we're really starting to spend more of our time focusing on protecting what we call nature's nurseries. So nature's nurseries are a series of stops along the Pacific Flyway, starting all the way up in Alaska, where a lot of our what we consider our shorebirds are breeding. And a lot of them are breeding on the west and the north slope of Alaska. And then they're stopping at a series of sites. And we've sort of identified on this map some of the key places we really work. You know, obviously they're stopping in other sites, but we have a team in Alaska working on a policy level. And then we have staff from Washington all the way down to San Diego Audubon and Mission Bay, working on really important sites where shorebirds and other water birds are stopping along the Pacific Flyway. We also work closely in Panama Bay because it's a really critical wintering site for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of shorebirds, particularly the western sandpiper. So we work closely with Panama Audubon. And lastly, we're investing in a program in Ridgeway Island because of the importance to godwits and overwintering habitat, especially for godwits but other shorebird species as well. So just wanted to show you this map to show you how our work does really span the entire Pacific Flyway. And I'm going to show you a couple of animations. I don't know how much people know about bird migration, but I'm going to show you two maps done by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And if you've ever put your data in eBird, you've helped make this map. And these really show the tremendous migration route, something like a Western sandpiper goes through. And just to put it in perspective, a Western sandpiper is a tiny little bird that weighs about 2.5 marshmallows. And they do this massive migration going all the way from the west slope of Alaska, all the way down to Panama and beyond. And eBird data really shows us their migration. So I'm just going to play this animation. And it shows the birds going from their breeding to their wintering grounds. And you can see all the way up as the color gets up to the west slope of Alaska and back down. And you can see they're getting all the way into South America. Let me just run it again because there's a lot to take in here.
Wow, yeah.
And you can see the importance when they hit California, the Central Valley in particular, and the coastline, it turns purple. And it, you know, this is just, I think this is just incredible image to show these really great migration routes. And then I'll show another one, another shorebird that we see a lot along our coastline. I know you would see this in Santa Barbara along the beach, the marbled godwit. And this is not as much of a long distance migrant, but having this data in eBird really shows us where these birds migrate to their breeding grounds up in the prairie potholes. And you'll see how different this map is for this bird. Again, following our coastline, and there they are on their breeding grounds in the summer. And then they show up back on the coast in Mexico, all the way down into Central America, some on the Gulf Coast of Texas. Again, I'll just run this one more time. So a lot of these shorebird species are on pretty steep declines, and it's a combination of what's happening on their breeding grounds because of climate change, and sort of a mismatch between when insects are hatching and when they're breeding in Alaska, plus all of the threats to estuaries that I'll talk about in a bit. And so one of the things Audubon has done is we've worked with 13 countries to put together a conservation plan to protect shorebirds like the ones I've just shown from their breeding grounds all the way down to Patagonia. And so we formed, it's called the Pacific Flyway Shorebird Business Plan, and that really guides all of our protection work throughout the flyway for these long distance migrants that have a very perilous journey. Oops, sorry, I'm trying to go to the next slide. And right here in California, why is our coastline so important? Well, it's important for a lot of reasons, including people. About 80% of California's population lives within 30 miles of the shoreline. So millions and millions of people live close to the shoreline. I wouldn't say everyone has equal access or the ability to access the shoreline in some of the urban areas, but our shoreline gets a lot of pressure from local residents as well as all the tourists that come to visit it. So as Audubon thinks about our work, we need to think about how to share the shoreline with the people that want to recreate at it. And that's sort of really important guiding force in our work, is considering the communities as well as the birds that we need to protect. And in particular, estuaries are not just important for all the shorebirds, they're incredibly important places for humans. The Port of Oakland is the 5th largest port in the country, and incredibly important, as you probably all know, for trade and commerce, shipping. So a lot of activity, a lot of our goods and services come in and out of the Oakland estuary. And so as we think about protecting these places, we have to recognize that there are needs such as transportation and commerce that come in and out of the estuaries as well. And what I like to say about particularly San Francisco Bay, it's probably the hardest working piece of land in California. It has to be a lot of things for a lot of people. It has to be a fishery for herring. It has to be a place for shorebirds to stop. It has to be a major transportation hub. It has to be a port for commerce. And it has to be a place where people can recreate. So it's very busy all the time doing a lot of different things. Oh, and it also filters a lot of water for us. And as I've sort of mentioned a little bit, the estuaries throughout the Pacific Flyway have a lot of value. They provide habitat, and I'll go into the habitat and the birds in a little bit. They provide fish estuaries for things like Dungeness crabs and Pacific herring. They provide recreation, including throwing eelgrass all over your friend, like in this picture. I took this photo in Tamales Bay, and I called this kid the eelgrass monster because he completely covered himself in eelgrass. And the great place for kayaking. It's a place that protects communities and habitats from the effects of climate change. It can buffer the impacts of storm surges and ocean acidification. And the sediment in estuaries stores blue carbon and gets it out of the atmosphere. Blue carbon is really the carbon, it's just a terminology used for carbon that's within marine environments. So whether it's eelgrass or tidal marshes, those are storing the carbon that we need to get out of the atmosphere. It helps prevent pollution and storm surges, and as I've mentioned, provides commerce and opportunities for transportation. So very, very hard-working landscapes. But they've experienced a lot of loss. This map shows the loss of the watersheds associated with estuaries and the kinds of habitat loss that we've seen. And so not so much in Southern California, but Central California, major loss of estuarine and watershed habitats, and a little bit less in Washington and Oregon, but the Salish Sea up in Northern Washington has also experienced a lot of habitat loss. So this is what we're starting with, and we need to think about protecting what we have left. And what are some of the threats to estuaries? I've sort of implied a few of them, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's everything you can think about, from dredging, that we need to dredge so boats can get in and out. Marine farming in sometimes is a threat, but it can also be a benefit. Aquaculture, that is. Filling, a lot of places like San Francisco Bay have experienced a lot of filling. You know, the original shoreline of San Francisco Bay is dramatically different than what it used to be. A lot of development on our coastline, introduced species that don't belong in the estuaries, sediment and pollution coming in from the rivers, and sewage treatment plants. So a lot of different things are impacting the estuaries. And a more proximate threat that we're seeing more and more of is coastal flooding. And that impacts the communities that are surrounding these estuaries. And in California, I've just checked on the statistic today, and right now 170,000 people are at risk of coastal flooding in California. By 2050, that's going to increase to over 200,000 people. And these are places where sea level rise and storm surge is continuing to accelerate. And for instance, in this picture of this man in Redwood City on the south end of San Francisco Bay that area has experienced a lot of flooding that it didn't have historically. And this chart shows the increase in the amount of days of coastal flooding in San Francisco Bay and how those have increased from both natural and human causes since 1950. And you can see it's really the human causes that have increased over time and led to instances like in this photo of increased coastal flooding. But there are things that we can do about this. And I like to say that because it's hard to give depressing statistics all the time, but you know, there's a lot we can do about improving conditions in our estuaries. And one of the most underloved plants in the estuaries is the eelgrass. And I call this the foundation of an estuary. And if you don't build a house with a solid foundation, your house is going to crumble. Well, the eelgrass is the same way. If you don't have eelgrass in the estuaries that traditionally supported eelgrass, the estuaries will crumble. It really ties everything together. It's an incredible resource that provides a lot of value for habitat, for commercial species such as Pacific herring in this photo, as well as not just the fish, but they lay their eggs on the eelgrass. It traps sediment, it traps carbon, it stabilizes the soil. It's an important food resource for a lot of birds. And so as Audubon's thought about working more to protect our estuaries, we're focusing a lot of our work on eelgrass because we need eelgrass in these estuaries if these estuaries are going to survive. And This looks really blurry. It will get a little less blurry in a second. I just want to explain what I'm going to show you here. One of the things I mentioned that eelgrass does is it supports a herring fishery. And in San Francisco Bay, it's the last commercial fishery. The herring fishery has not been able to do any business for the last 5 years because the herring numbers are so low that they haven't been able to fish. This year, however, the herring ran again, and we were not entirely sure why the conditions changed. But what happens when the herring run in San Francisco Bay? Well, they lay their eggs in the eelgrass, and then birds such as cormorants, scaup, and scoters hone in on those areas where the herring are running, and there's a massive feeding frenzy. And this photo was taken by one of our staff last week, this video, and it's one of the best herring run videos I've seen. Oops. Let's see, I'll just run it. And this is in actually Audubon's sanctuary. So this is a water sanctuary that Audubon California owns. And these birds are literally just chomping away at either picking out the herring or they're going underwater and eating the caviar, the eelgrass eggs, these herring eggs on the eelgrass. I'll just show it one more time because it's so cool.
Wow.
A lot of different species in here. And where is eelgrass located in California? It's located 80% of the state's eelgrass is located in San Francisco Bay. And that's why we still have a commercially viable, sometimes, herring industry. The other places where we have a lot of eelgrass, Humboldt Bay is second, and that's one of our most intact and undeveloped estuaries. Also really big numbers in Tamales Bay, where I showed you the picture of the kid covered in eelgrass that was taken in Tamales Bay. And then we also have eelgrass populations down in Mission Bay and San Diego Bay. So these, and then a little tiny dot in the middle here is Moro Bay, which, if you haven't heard, lost more than 90% of its eelgrass during this, right after the tsunami event about 5 or so years ago. And they've just figured out how to start regrowing eelgrass. So they're starting to see a little bit of return of their eelgrass bed, but they had a massive, massive die-off in Moro Bay. But these other estuaries still have pretty good populations of eelgrass. I just want to mention a few birds that are really reliant on eating eelgrass, and one is the Pacific brant. And this is probably the only bird that has to have eelgrass to 100% to survive. They eat the blades of the eelgrass and the bugs and invertebrates that are on the eelgrass. And they're breeding up in Alaska and coming down the coast of California. A lot of them spend time in Humboldt Bay and traditionally Moro Bay, although numbers are down in Moro Bay because of the loss of eelgrass. A lot in San Diego Bay, and probably the biggest numbers down here in Bahia de San Quintin in Mexico, in Baja, where the biggest population goes for the winter. But along the way, they have to stop and eat eelgrass. They eat eelgrass up in Alaska as well. So really important plant species for this bird to survive. Another one is a surf scoter, also reliant on eelgrass, but for a very different reason. Surf scoter are feeding on the eggs. So they come, about 50% of the whole population of surf scoters winters in San Francisco Bay, and they're there to eat eelgrass. I'm sorry, they're there to eat herring eggs. And so they're thick bills, which sometime of the year they're eating shellfish. The rest of the year in San Francisco Bay, they're feeding on this very nutrient-rich resource, the herring eggs. And so again, another species that's very reliant on the eelgrass and the herring. And then a few other birds I just want to mention in estuaries. There's so many, I'm just mentioning a few. Another one are the least and western sandpipers, and this is the least sandpiper here. And they're obviously in the mudflats around the edges of the estuaries, feeding on places where kelp and on beaches or eelgrass and estuaries are coming ashore, and they're eating the rich invertebrate resources that come out of these plants. And so again, this is a long distance migrant that is stopping and needs these valuable resources in order to have the energy to continue their migration. And last but not least, I have to mention the Ridgeway Israel, and the story of the Ridgeway Israel will come up again later in the presentation, but this is a federally endangered bird that lives in our estuaries. There are 3 subspecies of Ridgeway Israel. This is the California one that lives exclusively in San Francisco Bay and relies 100% on tidal marsh habitats. And so while most of our work is focused on eelgrass and the birds in eelgrass, we also work on Ridgeway Israel because they're so highly endangered and reliant on these very rare tidal marsh habitats that are left in San Francisco Bay. Plus, it's a really cute picture of a chick. Couldn't resist. Oh, another cute chick. And last but not least, not just estuaries, but the whole California coastline where there are beach habitats, as you well know, in Santa Barbara County are very important for snowy plovers. Most of the snowy plovers on the Pacific coast are associated with estuaries and river mouths where you get the richest variety of food resources and sediment renourishment on the beaches. And so while we think mostly about the interior of estuaries, the beach habitat is also incredibly important for snowy plovers and other birds. Now, I just want to take you on a quick tour of some of Audubon's work on the estuaries starting up in Alaska. Eisenbeck Lagoon is where 90% of the brant geese stop after breeding before they start migrating. So they all gather together there. And this is a site that was heavily threatened a couple years ago by the proposal to build a road right through the middle of this wetland and through the middle of this lake in particular. And so Audubon fought off that proposal and has managed to keep this estuary intact because of its importance, in particular to brant geese. And at the same time, we're working on trying to prevent oil drilling, as you know, and you've probably seen the emails about in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But this, in particular, this refuge was really about protecting the sort of post-breeding grounds of the brant geese. Going down into Washington and Willapa Bay. Willapa Bay is a really remote bay in Washington that has a lot of aquaculture in it. And unlike California, in Washington state, they allow the application of neonicotinoids, which is a very nasty pesticide, if some of you haven't heard of it, to spray over the shellfish beds because of a non-native crab that's in their estuaries. Of course, that has major implications for the entire food chain. So Audubon Washington got involved and actually got a bill passed to stop the use of spraying of neonicotinoids across Willapa Bay in Washington. That happened about 2 years ago. So big victory for Washington and the birds that rely on Willapa Bay. In Humboldt Bay in California, as I mentioned, it's our second largest eelgrass bed. And it's also one of the most intact estuaries, or if not the most intact estuary in California. If you haven't been up there, you should visit it sometime. One of the biggest numbers of marbled godwits in the state, as well as brant geese during migration, and more than 30% of the global population of Western sandpiper stop here. And our research has just shown really, really significant numbers of shorebirds. At the same time, we discovered an emerging threat. There was traditionally a 300-acre aquaculture bed in Humboldt Bay, and there was a proposal a few years ago by Coast Seafoods to expand it to several thousand acres. And the area they wanted to expand was right over the richest eelgrass beds. Well, Audubon sued, which we don't very often do, as you know, but we did sue Coast Seafoods with some of our partners, such as Earth Justice. And we ended up settling with them. And not only did they remove their proposal, but they shrunk the size of their existing bed. And now they've been willing to negotiate with us instead of getting into another lawsuit situation. Right now, they want to put in another small aquaculture facility, but we're able to work with them now and say, keep it out of the eelgrass and put it in this area. So we're using maps and science to help site these aquaculture projects away from the most critical resources. So it's much like wind farm or solar farm. We're not trying to prevent it altogether, but we're trying to direct it to the place, size it right and direct it to the places where you have the least impact on the resource. And this has been a huge victory for Audubon to be able to stop the development of this aquaculture while also keeping the industry alive in Humboldt Bay. And then a lot of our work's focused on San Francisco Bay. I'll be coming back to that in a minute to tell you more specifically about some of our projects in San Francisco Bay. But I wanted to just keep going down the coastline for a second and talk about some of the other places we're engaged. And this is mostly through our work with chapters. Southern California estuaries and wetlands are at a really interesting place right now. There's about 4 or 5 coastal wetlands, all that have restoration plans and are primed for restoration. And so one way Audubon can help is by identifying state funding and trying to support these projects and the chapters in going forward. And one of them is the Los Cerritos Wetlands in Long Beach, which Eldorado Audubon has been fighting to restore for about 10 years. And we've been along to help them the entire time. Most of the work is done by the chapter, but we provide letters of support. And right now we're looking at whether there's state funding that could support the restoration of this highly, highly degraded estuary. And despite how degraded it is, California lease terns still go in there and feed. But it needs a lot of work to restore. And then there are other estuaries and wetlands in Southern California all ready to restore as well, including Bayona Wetlands in Los Angeles, Buena Vista Lagoon in San Diego County, and a few others. So it's a really exciting moment right now where a lot of these habitats are, and Mission Bay in San Diego is the other one, where all these places have plans and now they just need the funding to be restored. And so we're trying to spend more time engaging in those places. And this is just a quick example because San Diego Audubon, I wanted to mention, is so engaged in Mission Bay. This is our most altered estuary in California. I mean, it barely resembles its former self. But San Diego Audubon has developed a project which I think is really cool called Rewired Mission Bay. And so they want to undevelop a portion of Mission Bay and turn it back into tidal marshes and mudflats for shorebirds and water habitat for eelgrass. And it's a really innovative strategy to try and buy up a piece of land and change it from a campground back into wild habitat. And they're doing really great work. It's not all approved or funded yet, but they're on their way to be able to do something really cool. And it's the only place I've heard of rewilding a habitat like this on our coastline. Now I just wanted to dive in a little bit deeper into the waters of San Francisco Bay because that is where Audubon California and myself have focused most of our work to date. San Francisco Bay, as I've already mentioned, is incredibly hardworking place. It's also the largest estuary on the Pacific coast, and tens of thousands, if not millions, of shorebirds and waterfowl pass through San Francisco Bay. Some of them spend the winter there. There's 8 million people ringing the bay that want access to recreation opportunities and transportation around San Francisco Bay. So it's heavily threatened, but it also has a lot of attention focused on it. So a lot of good things are happening in San Francisco Bay, and it has this crucial resource, the foundation that holds the bay together, the eelgrass habitats. And you can see in these images where the wetlands traditionally were in San Francisco Bay compared to today. So about 80% of the bay's wetlands have been filled, and there's now houses on them. So really the area up in the North Bay, these diked baylands, are some of the last remaining somewhat intact wetlands in San Francisco Bay. And I'm going to talk to you more about that area. And down in the South Bay are these diked baylands that became salt ponds and for the salt industry. And this area you may have heard about in the news is the subject to the largest wetlands restoration project in the West. The only other project as big as this is the coastal project is the Everglades. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is restoring 15,000 acres of these diked baylands that were salt ponds back into tidal marshes and mudflats. And so millions of dollars are going into the South Bay. We're not very involved in there because it's a very crowded field of people being involved. So we really have been focusing our work up in San Pablo Bay where there's less attention. And I'll give you an example of a project in San Pablo Bay. One of the ways we do our work in San Francisco Bay is through science. And I just wanted to mention one example of science. Audubon owns a waterbird sanctuary in Richardson Bay, which is in the north part of San Francisco Bay. And as most of San Francisco Bay has made the bay off limits for living on boats, Sausalito in the North Bay didn't really pay attention to those regulations. And so over time, and also with the housing crisis in San Francisco, more and more boats started showing up in Richardson Bay, just on the edge of our sanctuary. And at its highest count, about 300 boats were living in Richardson Bay in the eelgrass bed. And it's become a big problem because it's not a safe and hospitable place for people to live. And the boats themselves have caused massive amount of damage to the eelgrass bed. And so we used aerial imagery and GIS science to quantify the amount of damage the boats were causing by their anchor scours, and quantified 84 acres of damage to this eelgrass bed. The state agency we approached with this information said, oh, what is this, like an acre of eelgrass damage you're talking about? And we said, no, it's at least 84 acres of damage. And so more than 2/3 of the boats have been removed from the bay, and the cities are working to rehouse people. So there's still about 100 boats out there, and we're working on a plan with the cities in the region to make a permanent anchor for those boats outside of the eelgrass beds, because at the same time, we don't want to kick people out if it's the only home they have. So we've been working on solutions that will work for the people in the region, as well as protect and restore this eelgrass bed. And it was really our science, which we published in a journal, that led us to the conclusion that these boats were causing this large amount of damage to the eelgrass bed. And that's just another image of that. And then lastly, I've talked about the science, and I wanted to mention the restoration, because I wouldn't say Audubon's a big scale restoration organization, but we do specific projects. And we do projects where we see a real opportunity to demonstrate a type of restoration that can be replicated, or we do a restoration that can impact policy and have a larger impact than the site itself. There are 3 ongoing projects. One's in Marin City, where we're working on developing a plan to restore a small tidal wetland on the edge of Marin City, which is a low-income, predominantly Black community on the shores of Marin City, on the shores of the bay, that have been left out of most of the funding and the planning resources in San Francisco. And there's major health problems in the region from the flooding. They get cut off from their houses and their resources because of so much flooding in their city. So we're developing a plan to restore a wetland and relieve the city of its flooding. And we're working with a community-based organization to do that project. In Rambu Island, I'll show you some pictures of that. We're doing a small island restoration project within the borders of our sanctuary. And then we're also working up in San Pablo Bay, up north here. It's a place called Sonoma Creek. So at Rambu Island was a dredge spoil island. It was basically a bunch of soil dumped in the middle of Richardson Bay while houses were built along the shoreline so that they could have docks and boat fronts. And it just sat there as this degraded pile of mud for years with weeds on it. And we came up with the idea of turning it into bird habitat and experimenting with this idea of living shorelines. And so a living shoreline is where you create a shoreline that's resilient to climate change instead of creating hard walls and riprap. So it's a place where the environment can absorb water and have habitat instead of just being a wall. And it's a new concept for San Francisco Bay, and one that we wanted to do to create habitat for terns in particular, but also shorebirds, and also a place for seals to haul out in the bay. So about 10 years ago, we restored the island, or actually recreated the island. It's 15 acres, and we got settlement money from the Costco Busan oil spill to pay for this project. Within 2 years of building the project, we had oyster catchers nesting on the island for the first time ever in Richardson Bay. And this year, while COVID was going on, Caspian terns started to sneak onto the island. Caspian terns are pretty uncommon in San Francisco Bay, but we started to hear from some birders that they were seeing some, and we had a COVID-safe small group of people go out into the island towards the end of last summer, and they found a Caspian tern egg. So we've actually created a Caspian tern colony on Rambu Island, which we're absolutely thrilled about because we built the island for terns. We just didn't know if they'd ever show up. And we also have large numbers of elegant terns in late summer, early fall coming to stage before they migrate. So this has been a really successful project, and it's a place where we bring a lot of volunteers and student groups to learn about habitat restoration and birds on San Francisco Bay. And the last project I wanted to mention is the Sonoma Creek Enhancement Project. And this has been sort of a labor of love for me in particular. I've been working on this project for about 8 years. And we were approached by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to work on San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge because they wanted to restore a wetland that was heavily degraded. They only have 2 staff up there. So they asked Audubon if we could help them, and also if we could find funding. And what they wanted to do was, I won't go into all the details of this project because it's a presentation by itself, but this is an aerial view of this 400-acre tidal marsh. The middle of the marsh was completely dead because it was formed by sediment from the gold mining era, and it didn't form naturally, so it doesn't have channels in it to drain water out of it. So in storms and high tide events, water was getting into this marsh, getting stuck, causing this die out in the middle here, and also creating massive mosquito breeding conditions. So the refuge had to actually spray, by health code orders, aerially spray the refuge with pesticides to eliminate the mosquitoes. Same time around the edges, we have Ridgeway Israels trying to breed, and we have salmonids trying to get in here. So it was a condition that we wanted to stop the mosquito spraying, and we also wanted to revive this marsh so it would be better for the wildlife. And we also thought this would be a good opportunity to test how you could prepare a marsh for sea level rise. So in 2015, we received a $2 million federal grant, and we set about building this 2-mile-long channel through the marsh. And we had to do it in 2 phases. And the second phase was completed last October. So we've now finished digging this large channel through the marsh out into Sonoma Creek, and that basically drains the marsh. And we also built a lateral channel here up into the edges, and all the material we dredged out of this marsh, we made a transition zone. We made a gentle sloping ramp so that birds such as Ridgeway Israel and the saltmarsh harvest mouse, which is a federally endangered mouse that lives with the rails, so that they could walk out of the marsh in high tide events and sea level rise. And we also created mini islands so that shorebirds had a place to rest in the middle of this water inundated marsh. The project has been incredibly successful. We finished in October, and we've almost completely eliminated the need for mosquito spraying. We've seen the return of a lot more Ridgeway rails and black rails to the habitat, and we've seen the marsh regrowing. And the policy component of this project, because I said our restoration projects have to have some kind of demonstration value, is we were actually denied a permit when we tried to start this project. And we were denied a permit by the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, because they have a policy against bay fill. As I said, 80% of San Francisco Bay is being filled. So they said, no more filling anywhere in the Bay. And so our project went against our policy. And so we said, well, there are places where you want to use fill, and it's called beneficial reuse, where you use fill to improve conditions for habitat and you help a marsh adapt to sea level rise. So finally, after much arguing, and we had a lot of chapters behind us writing letters and supporting us, they finally gave us a permit to do this project. And as I said, we finished it last October, and I'm going to show you a fun little video of the project as well. On the right is our amphibious excavator that was put to work to dig out the channels in the marsh. And while we're out in the marsh with the excavator, we had to have what were called mouse sweepers. And these were our biological technicians that had to ensure, because of our permit conditions, that we didn't harm or harass any salt marsh harvest mouse in the course of this project. So the staff literally had to sweep the marsh side to side as the machinery walked through it to ensure that we weren't harming any mouse. And I'm happy to report that no mice were harmed in the making of this project. And this is a before and after picture of the phase we did in 2015. On the right, you can see the large channel that we dug through the marsh that was over a mile long. On the left is a picture I took in October of what that channel looks like today, standing in the same place. So you can see on the right, all this was dead vegetation, no marsh vegetation. On the left, it's incredibly diverse, robust marsh plain with this channel that looks very natural at this point, winding through it. We've seen fish in there, a lot of shorebirds along these muddy edges. These Salicornia areas are filled with salt marsh harvest mouse and Ridgeway Israels. So we've really seen a dramatic change in this marsh over time. And this is a picture of the recent construction that we completed in October, which will turn to a natural state, as I showed in the previous image. But I wanted to show this because this is what it looks like to dredge a soupy marsh. We built it with these sort of stairs going out of the channel so that animals can, get out of, it's not a steep edge, but it's slope-sided for animals. And also we put the mud in these little islands along the edge. And those are places that shorebirds can stop in migration and have a place to rest, especially when the tide is too high for them to be able to sit on the marsh. So that's what it looked like in October, and it will fill in and become a natural looking marsh in the next couple of years. So in summary, and then I'm just going to show you a fun little video of the project that I think you'll enjoy. And this is a picture of two of our estuary staff in San Francisco, Paige Fernandez and Hamar Lim. Our estuary program vision is to, for coastal ecosystems, to provide high quality habitat for birds and foster coastal resilience for communities. So as I said, we're working now on expanding the work we've done in San Francisco Bay and making it coast-wide, and working in combination with chapters and community-based organizations to do that work. And we do it with all the tools in the toolbox that I've mentioned today, and that includes the science. And what we're doing now is developing models for eelgrass and determining where are the best places to grow and protect eelgrass into the future. We're working with communities on planning for sea level rise through local coastal plans and supporting community-based restoration project, partnering with chapters such as San Diego Audubon. We're working at a state level on ensuring that there are bills coming out for coastal resilience. There was actually a coastal resilience bill last year that failed. And so we're going to try again to have a coastal resilience bill that drives funding to our coastline and to communities along our coastline. And we're going to keep working on these demonstration scale restoration projects to demonstrate different ways to restore habitats along the California coastline. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take questions.
That was great, Andrea. Thank you so much. So interesting, and I learned a lot. Are there any questions and anyone has of Andrea? You can write them in the chat function right now and I'll ask them out loud or she'll read them.
I got one privately that I don't think Terry would mind me reading. Terry asked how the tsunami affected the eelgrass in Moro Bay. Well, there's a lot of theories about the die-off of the eelgrass, but one of them was that it scoured out so much sediment out of the bay. I was actually at Moro Bay when it happened, and the entire estuary drained. I mean, it was just left with mud, so a lot of sediment got pulled out with it, and that sort of changed the conditions that the eelgrass need to grow in. And so that's one of the theories, but then there's also other theories around too much nitrogen coming in from combined sewer overflows, and also warming temperatures. So it was kind of a combination of issues, but the tsunami was considered to be one of the reasons for the impact.
Great, thank you. There's another question. Can you talk please a bit about the mosquito abatement, natural and community concerns?
Yeah, so in places where you don't have proper drainage and water circulation are the places you're most likely to have large numbers of mosquitoes. And so what we did in Sonoma Creek was made sure water that comes, it's okay for water to go in a marsh, you just want it to go out. You don't want stagnant water because that creates the conditions for mosquito breeding. And most areas in the state have mosquito control districts that monitor mosquito conditions. And this was a really hot spot for mosquitoes. And so they had to spray because of community concerns. Sonoma Creek is near the very large city of Vallejo. And so there were concerns about those issues. And so by allowing the marsh to drain and for the water to circulate, eliminated the need for mosquito abatement. And even in interior Central Valley in California, when they build breeding season wetlands for breeding birds, one of the things they do to prevent mosquito production is to have the water be able to circulate. And so you need pumps and aeration in the water, and that helps prevent mosquito. It's not perfect, but just trying to reduce the need to spray while keeping communities safe from disease concerns. It's also not an area of my expertise.
Okay, there's a comment. Wow, great work. And a question is, can you please talk about the Devereaux Slough? And then there's a question that's somewhat related. Can you please speak to the issue, how can you assist issues of urgency in Santa Barbara?
So, hi, Mark. I know Mark, so hi, nice to see you. I've heard a little bit about Devereaux Slough from Jesse Allstat and some of the concerns there with the airport. At this point, one of the things, to be completely frank, we don't have the staff yet to work in every coastal issue in California. It's just me outside of San Francisco Bay. So we're in a capital campaign right now to raise funds to be able to have a coastal team up and down our coastline to specifically work with chapters. In the meantime, absolutely, I can write letters of support. That's something either myself or someone in our policy team can do. I do it all the time for chapters. I'll be reaching out to coastal chapters in the next few weeks, in fact, for lists of where you need funding for coastal projects, because we're trying to build a list to advocate for our policy team, which is very strong in Sacramento, to advocate for funding to get to coastal projects. And also Executive Order 30 by 30, which some of you may have heard of, to increase the amount of protected lands in California to 30%. We're trying to identify places along the coastline to prioritize and get that list to the state. So we're going to be sending you a survey, and we're also going to have a webinar on 30 by 30 to specifically solicit information from chapters on not just places for restoration, but where, like on the Goleta coastline, for instance, you want to prioritize places for land protection. But in the meantime, Mark, anything I can do to write letters or other kinds of advocacy, we're more than happy to do that.
Okay, there's a question. Thank you for that offer. There's a question, when the birds come, do they spread out over the 2 miles?
I'm not sure what 2 miles they're referring to. Is it the channel that we built through the Sonoma Creek?
Mary, would you like to respond? That's what I would think, Andrea.
Yeah, what we've seen is as we built the channel through the marsh and the marsh is regrown, we have seen the Ridgeway Israels in particular were really concentrated around the edges because that was the only place there was marsh vegetation growing. But now that we've seen the marsh regrow, the birds have definitely spread out. And the shorebirds, like in that video, the shorebirds were, it's really cool I took that shaky video of the shorebirds flying around. It was cool to see that, but they were doing that because there was nowhere for them to land. And now that we've built these mini islands spread throughout the marsh, there are these little spots for them, even on the highest tide events, as places for the shorebirds to land. So yes, they have really spread out.
Okay, and there's a question, is there any work being done at Moss Landing? That's from Tony and Terry McQueen.
Great question. I am not too familiar with work going on up there, but Monterey Audubon is involved and in fact is more interested in getting involved with coastal issues, and they're about to hire their first ever coastal advocate position that will be a paid position to work on issues at places like Moss Landing and other places along the coastline of Monterey Bay. But I don't know specifically work going on in Moss Landing.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's one by John Callender.
Oh, well, John, yes. I think she had answered that. John Calendar's message is, I've been involved in developing responses to sea level rise in Carpinteria, including the possibility of using living shoreline restoration of the coastal dune and the historic extent of the Carpinteria salt marsh. Is this something I might reach out to Audubon California about to see what resources, recommendations you might have?
Absolutely. We completed a 10-year report of our Rambu Island Living Shorelines project about 3 months ago, and I'm happy to share that report to you because it will describe the work we did and the results of our work. And I can also recommend, I'm going to put my email address, and then if you want to reach out to me, John, I can get you some information. There's also a couple of living shoreline projects happening now in San Leandro that Audubon's not involved with, but they're also really good examples of projects you might want to investigate. And those are being done by East Bay Regional Parks District. But I can get you some contacts for those as well.
Great. Okay, well, that looks like those are the questions for now. So thank you again, Andrea, for a great presentation, beautiful slides, and I learned a ton. It was really fun to see what, some of the new research is on estuaries and eelgrass. So thank you for giving us that focused presentation. And a couple parting remarks. David recorded this presentation and it will be made available on our website within a few days, give or take, along with the recordings from our previous 4 programs. Those topics included hummingbirds, alternatives to rodenticides, using native California plants to create bird habitat at home, and birding in Colombia. So go to santabarbaraudubon.org for that. Our next program will be in exactly 4 weeks on Wednesday, March 24th. And we're excited to have a talk on the breeding bird study of Santa Barbara County, 5 years on, what we have learned. And that will be by our very own Mark Holmgren and Adrian O'Loughlin. So thank you to them. And again, that's March 24th. So we hope to see you there. Thank you all for attending and good night.